reception for Forthcoming. This is a closing reception, and am I live? Yes, good. Okay, great.
We just made it live, so you may want to start it.
Okay. Can everybody hear me? All right. So after lots and lots of technical difficulties, I think we're ready to go now. Thank you so much for being here. Welcome to the virtual reception for Forthcoming. This is a closing reception. I hope that some of you have had a chance to see the exhibition. If you haven't, that's okay, because you're going to get a chance to see some of the work right here tonight. Before we get started on the main event, I'm going to make a couple of announcements and then tell you a little bit about the show. And then we have a special pre-recorded program. Each of the artists has recorded a 15-minute talk about the work in the show and also their work as artists. And that video includes images of the artwork too. The video is 29 minutes long, so you may want to get something to write with and so you can write down some of your questions, because when we get to the end of the video program, the artists are actually here and they are going to be available for questions. So announcements. Next Monday is the beginning of our capstone program. So we have 2 capstone exhibitions. The graduating senior students in the School of Art and Design will be presenting their capstone shows. The first one is opening next Monday, November 2, and that is open from Monday to Thursday. And there is a virtual reception Monday night at 5:30, and you'll get a chance to see some of the artists' work and hear them give their talks. And this is a really special exhibition because it marks the culmination of everything that they've done as art students at Marshall. Now, we have 2 of them actually, 2 weeks in a row. So Monday, November 2, and then again on Monday, November 9th. And both of those will have Monday receptions at 5:30 p.m. Now, Forthcoming is in the Burke Art Gallery right now, and it has been up since October 5th, and it closes tomorrow. If you are in the area and you haven't had a chance to see it and you really want to, you can email me at galleries@marshall.edu, and I can help schedule an appointment for you to get in and see it on the very last day, if you can make it tomorrow. But like I said, you're going to get a chance to see some of the work here tonight. So the exhibition is actually, it's artwork by 2 new faculty in the School of Art and Design, Matt Smith, who teaches sculpture, and Alora McCullough, who teaches ceramics. Both of these artists are grappling with how to respond to the current moment as artists and as human beings, as you'll see in their presentations. It's been an honor for me to get to work with Matt and Alora in their first semesters as full-time faculty here, and just really fun getting to know them. They are creative and smart and genuine in all of the ways that one would hope their professors would be, and their students are very lucky to have them, and as are we all. Alora is a visiting assistant professor in the School of Art and Design. She received her MFA in ceramics from the State University of New York at New Paltz in 2015, and her BBA in economics and finance from the McKendree University in 2010. Alora has completed 2 ceramic studio residencies and actively exhibits her work in juried shows. She is an avid traveler and has lived in more than 15 different states. Alora uses ceramic materials and mixed media to create narrative installations about overcoming challenges and difficulties in life. Matt Smith joined the faculty as an assistant professor of sculpture. He received his BA in art education from Anderson University in Indiana, spent a year in post-bac studies at Syracuse University, and completed his MFA in studio arts from the University of Colorado in Boulder in 2017. Upon graduation, Matt taught numerous 3D foundations courses at Metropolitan State University, then ran the foundations program at CU Boulder as the interim coordinator. He currently teaches all levels of sculpture. Within his studio practice, Matt engages a broad array of materials, processes, and conceptual investigations. Performance, video, social practice, installation, and public interventions, along with both digital and traditional craft-based ways of making objects with wood, ceramic, and fiber are staples in his studio endeavors. He has carried out public projects in New York and Colorado, along with showing at numerous galleries, including Forum Gallery at the Cranbrook Academy of Art and Union Hall in Denver. Without further ado.
Thank you, Jamie. My name is Alora McCullough, and this is the Cosmic Egg and Attendance. I'm going to tell you about my inspirations and my process. Over the summer, I was making a lot of small works that really were processing grief and the stress of everything we're all going through with the pandemic. I looked at everything I made and I realized that I didn't want to show them to anybody. They were deeply personal and sometimes painful. And ultimately, I didn't want to create more of this type of sadness in the world. So I destroyed them and I started over. I began planning what I would make for this exhibit, and the dialogue from this comic book page stuck in my mind. I am alone. I look at the heavens and think them empty. And if not empty, I find the idea of worshiping whatever dwells there obscene. But why do you continue? It doesn't change what is right. If there's nothing but what we make in this world, brothers, let us make good. It's this last line that really stuck to me. If there's nothing but what we make in this world, let us make good. And I clung to this notion that whatever we make in our artistic practices is a literal creation. It's what we put into the world that we want to live in. And I want to make something fundamentally good. I know that I want to fill a space with a sense of hope. My research encompasses a lot of mythology. I'm inspired by pop culture and a variety of world religions. And I enjoy reading a lot of Joseph Campbell's books. I remembered this quote of his: "Find a place inside where there's joy, and the joy will burn out the pain." I think we're living in a painful time, and so I'm trying to fill some space with joy. The cosmic egg is one of the most prominent icons in world mythology. It's also known as the world egg or a mundane egg. The cosmic egg recurs throughout mythology and religion, philosophy, and pop culture as a symbol of the world waiting to be born. What might hatch from our struggles? What might be born from our suffering? This icon can be found in Egyptian, Babylonian, Polynesian, Chinese, Hindu, and many other creation stories. In almost all cases, this embryonic motif emerges out of darkness, floating upon the waters of chaos. The cosmic egg is a metaphor of potentiality. It is the pre-creation held within chaos. It's the birth of the new world. It's the potential for the future, and I want to look forward to the future with a sense of hope. So what would that look like? I started to think about strong women. archetypes of the divine feminine, historic figures, and religious icons. This is an important part of my process. I began to write lists of these women. Who would I want to be present to welcome the new world? What figures would attend the birth of what's coming next? What stories and myths have given me strength, and what has given me hope to move forward on a day-to-day basis when everything around us is literal chaos? Kuan Yin is a goddess of compassion and mercy. She eases suffering. Medea is a figure of magic and witchcraft. She's the ultimate heroine, villain, and victim all rolled into one. The three fates make me feel like the little things that I do on a daily basis are important and that they have meaning, because they weave and spin and create the events that take place in the world. They are crafting with their hands underground, the women's work in the underworld, and it inevitably contributes to everything that happens. Athena is the goddess of wisdom and justified war. She's a provider and a protector. When there's chaos and destruction and injustice, she's willing to take action and fight. I have a deep curiosity and connection to human figures that are made in terracotta clay. This clay comes from the earth and it's connected to many creation mythologies itself. Human beings have been formed from clay in many of these stories, and clay as a material can last for thousands of years. I use this material the same way that artists used it thousands of years ago, and in some way I hope that the things that I am making in the world today or tomorrow or next month will outlast my life and may be discovered or questioned or inspire people 2,000 years from now. So I began to think about women in my life who have had a positive impact on me. I wrote down the names of individuals who have given me guidance, who have been with me through troubled times, who have offered a sense of direction or inspiration. I listed the names of women who have been there to comfort me or to stand up for me. They are mothers, friends, coworkers, mentors, spiritual guides, colleagues, and classmates. They are artists, doctors, and teachers. I've used their likenesses as inspiration for my sculptures. They are the ones who are attending the cosmic egg. So about my process. I knew I wanted to make the egg, and that was simple enough. But once I'd created the focal point of this installation, it needed a nest. So I spent several days gathering sticks and branches, twigs and vines. I took from a sassafras tree. I took from the tree in my backyard. I picked up things on my daily walks with my dog. And I began to research nest architecture and different bird species and building strategies and how they made their nests. And I struggled. I really struggled with this part. It continually collapsed on me. And I was really amazed and inspired by how birds naturally develop these complex structures. They're so simple and yet so strong. And they don't have years of architecture or books to read to learn how to do this. It's this intuition, this natural thing that they're born with in their brains that tell them to gather these things and huddle around them and stick them together with their tiny little claws and beaks, and they're able to make their homes. And I was struggling. Eventually, I stopped trying to control it so much. I stopped trying to make it so perfectly round or egg-shaped, and I just allowed the materials to overlap and to bend and to create tension against themselves. Once I finally relaxed, this process became much simpler, and I was able to create the nest I was looking for. That idea of being able to relax into the process is something I'm trying to remember now on a daily basis. Some things need thoughtful planning. Some things need very specific architectural plans and structures and designs. And other things are best created when you allow yourself to focus on the process rather than the end result. I coil build my figures, beginning with strands of clay, and I always make more than I need. I wanted to create 13 women, and sculpture is not perfect. Things crack, things break, ceramics are fragile. So I began with 15 busts. I create an internal structure to prevent the weak points from collapsing. I built up their heads and I map out facial features. I close them in, I seal them shut so that I have a hollow form. And then I smooth them out and I let them sit. They have to be firm for a while before I can start the next steps, which are to cut them open again and begin adding in the facial features. So I have been fortunate to study with some really wonderful educators and artists who work with portrait sculpture and the human face, and I refer back to that all of the time. I share that information all of the time with people who are trying to make in this same way, and my class just finished doing self-portraits in a similar fashion. Once I've finished the facial features, then I go and I add the mass of hair. I build up in solid clay the form that I want. Then I go in and add the details and smooth out the hair to create the overall texture and lightness. And then I cut that open again and I have to hollow it out and then reattach it. So things are never complete once you're done with one step. There's always this repetition of breaking things open and stitching them back together and ripping apart the clay and then slipping and scoring. And then it has to go through this incredibly intense firing process, and there's something about the ritual of that bending and breaking and stitching and taking it apart and putting it back together again that I just absolutely love about working with this material. I needed to create their structure, the support. I wanted something that would be uniquely feminine and also have a sense of a connection to nature. So I made these discs that were then supported by rods of bamboo. I was inspired by hoop skirts and bird cages and this overall shape that a hollow structure built with many, many small pieces can then support something both heavy and fragile and delicate and precious, but that there's also a sense of tension. When I was making these pedestals, I could have used nails or screws and tied them together with those kinds of clamping materials, but I really wanted to go back to that notion of how I made the nest and how a sense of tension and thoughtful placement of the parts can create a structure. So I researched and learned how to do a traditional Japanese fence binding technique. So there is no metal hardware used to build these pieces. They're entirely bound together with twine and natural vines. I'm an ambitious artist and I enjoy working with multiples. Previous installations have had dozens and even hundreds of handmade items in repetition. For this project, I've selected 13 women to act as attendants for the cosmic egg. The first 3 have arrived. I look forward to continuing this project as we continue to discover what the future might hold for us.
Hi, everyone. Welcome to our Artist Talks for Forthcoming. My name is Matt Smith. I am the Visiting Assistant Professor of Sculpture here at Marshall University and an artist in my own right. I thought I would take a moment just to introduce myself without a mask on. I'm here safely in my office, but wanted to go ahead and say hi. Some of you who have only spent time in the VAC this semester, I have not seen. And even if you've been in the art warehouse, you've never really seen me without a mask on. So I thought I'd do this face-to-face in some virtual way. And I'm excited for you to see the show. It's really interesting work, and hopefully you can make it to the Burke Art Gallery before it closes at the end of October. But in my artist talk, I'll talk a bit about the origins of the work, how it evolved, and then how it finalized for the gallery itself. Enjoy.
So for my project in the Burke Art Gallery called Know How It Spreads, I need to give you some background information. So this started in Eldora, Colorado, before I moved to West Virginia. And Eldora is a small town, a very small town. It has 150 people, and I like to joke that it gets twice as much snow. So it gets 300 plus inches of snow a year. And this is a really beautiful area. There's lots of national forests there. It's about 45 minutes outside of Boulder and about an hour and 10 minutes northwest of Denver. And that's important because there's huge populations of people there, and that becomes really important to the story. The Hesty Trailhead is an incredibly beautiful area that's in the national forest. And so people from Boulder and Denver would come up during the weekends, and they'd travel or walk about 3 miles to Lost Lake. And so Lost Lake is incredibly gorgeous. And there's these snow-capped mountains. It's a high alpine lake. There's a ski resort nearby. So it is just beautiful through and through. And obviously, many people come up here. And it's important to note that so many people come up here that they create an entire bus system to bring people up here because there's not enough parking spots at the trailhead. So the nearest town, 15 minutes away, buses people in. Now, this all somehow deals with COVID, and this is a quick image of my grocery store back in Boulder, similar to a Kroger's, and obviously this is what we saw back in March. And how this all relates is that as quarantine happens, people start going into the mountains. This is all during the time that I teach at the University of Colorado in Boulder, and there's a group or a program there called the Center for Humanities and Arts. And I promise I'll wrap this all around because I've talked about mountains and COVID and trails, and now I'm talking about a university. But the Center for Humanities and Arts, their only job is to advocate for the arts and put programs in front of people that deal with art. So they created a grant program for quarantine that said, show us your poems, your artwork, all of this stuff that might address like what it means to be human during COVID. And so I was like, well, in my town, lots of people are coming up when they're supposed to stay home. And so I'd like to address that. And so I made a series of trail signs that were supposed to be kind of humorous and silly and straightforward. That simply said, if you're walking these trails, you need to be wearing a mask. I took CDC guidelines and literally just put out like, you know, stay socially distant, even if you're outdoors. And that was a concern because hundreds of people every weekend were coming up to my hometown. Now, none of this matters after May because George Floyd has been murdered by police, and there's gigantic protests that are happening across the country. And meanwhile, I'm trying to finish out teaching. All of you were either here at Marshall or you were finishing up your last year of high school, maybe, or at least most of you were. And so we're all in this very weird phase. And, you know, the grant at this point doesn't even matter. I'm thinking about George Floyd and Black Lives Matter and these protests and this national reckoning. But I also wrote a grant about COVID. And so I have to like figure out what is the crossover? So I stay with the trail signs, but I decide that I want to overlap these two things. And so I look through the CDC guidelines for anything that would speak to both of them. And I actually found a lot of overlap. So this idea of like, what does it mean to be dealing with a virus or a disease? And what does it mean to be dealing with racism and police brutality? And so I crossed those over. I found 3 CDC guidelines that spoke very directly to this, that I most literally could put in parentheses after COVID-19 or racism. So a number of these signs, like for instance, this one says prompt identification or voluntary isolation will keep people with COVID-19 or racism from spreading that virus. In other signs, I said simply, if you may have this disease and you might not even know you have it, and you can spread it. I finished the grant. I drove across the country to West Virginia. As soon as I got to West Virginia and to Marshall, all of these things unroll. I have to figure out how I'm going to make a show here. And so I decided to take on the same thing. I go to Seneca Rocks. I go to Spruce Knob. I go to these big scenic areas of national forest that are in West Virginia that feel relevant to what I'm doing now and hopefully feel relevant to you. And I take those on as the new project. So I take the same signs because they deal with national forest and I put them, at least temporarily, in situ. And so when you walk into the gallery, you're going to find the signs side by side. And so on one side, I'll have the sign, and on the other side, I'll have a photograph of the sign in situ. In situ meaning in location or in place. And so the signs directly relate, again, to CDC guidelines, to COVID. Here's a close-up of it so you can see a little bit more. And it was almost eerie to me, like some of the language around this. You know, you could break the chain of disease transmission if you decided just to isolate. How appropriate is that? Maybe for even racism. As far as the signs themselves, you can see above there's a little sign about Spruce Knob, and below there's the other sign. They're both brown and yellow. They're rectangular with little rounded edges. So I'm trying to use the language of national forest and even national park signage to create something that somebody who would walk into that space wouldn't quite understand maybe what was happening at first. So I'm trying to get that language to meet up so it's not too jarring, because the message can be pretty jarring. If you're not expecting, or maybe I should say if you're expecting to go out and just go fishing or go hiking, and all of a sudden you come upon this sign that talks about what you should do with COVID-19, and then you find out what you should do about racism, that's really intense. You're trying to go out for a hike or trying to have a day off, and all of a sudden this artist or this sign in particular is trying to bring you back into a cultural context that demands that you ask questions about what's happening. Now, I found 3 CDC guidelines that felt like they matched up pretty well with racism, police brutality, and the like. And so I made 3 different signs, and I ended up taking 3 different pictures of those signs. And I'd like to say now, you know, what is in the gallery is like what you'll see as kind of the finished product. But as students, especially if you're a student, I want to say I almost had a whole second body of work that I did for this project that didn't actually come to fruition. I wasn't happy with the way that it ended up, but it was really constant. I was out there in the field, out in nature with these signs, trying to get something to happen that didn't actually happen. And so I think I don't know. I always tell you guys, if you're in my class anyways, I constantly tell you, you know, there are things that like I may not see. That's what a sketchbook's for. I need to be able to see those things. So half of the work that was supposed to be in the show didn't even show up simply because it didn't work out the way that I thought it would. But these photos and the signs themselves did, and I think that's really important. A quick note, this sign is a spruce knob, so it's the tallest point in West Virginia. I put it in a picnic pavilion area, somewhere where like people might sit down and just like try to eat their lunch, and then they have to encounter this thing that I've put it in front of them. This sign in particular is really interesting because it talks less, it still talks about racism, but less directly. And in parentheses here, which is hard to tell here, but you'll see later, is police brutality, or the idea of getting a lawyer if there's some kind of issue with police. But the list of symptoms here go away from if you have the disease, if you have COVID-19, if you have racism, and towards if you're being a victim of those things. So the idea of having trouble breathing, the idea of having a persistent cough. One that struck me really intensely is quote unquote new confusion. And this idea that maybe if you're a victim of police brutality, you might come into a place of new confusion. It's the third one down. Or if you were lying in a hospital dealing with COVID, you might have new confusion. It's something that's so vague and yet is also so pointed. And then the last two, obviously, like the idea that maybe you can't stay awake or you have bluish lips, those are really haunting when it comes to police brutality or COVID-19. So the crossover there seemed really, really close to me. The last one I'll show you in the gallery is one that I took at Seneca Rocks. And this is actually the most straightforward sign. It's almost an introduction of the signs, because it simply says if you have, or if you don't have, I should say, if you don't have symptoms, you could still spread it. And I feel like this is maybe the point that's maybe closest to my own upbringing, which is, you know, I lived in a really small town, and I grew up in a way where I don't think people around me understood any of the complexities of racism or exactly what that meant. And so I grew up with parents or grandparents or aunts and uncles who, even though I wouldn't have called them at the time, you know, racist, they were definitely expressing some racist ideas. And so this idea that maybe you don't have symptoms, but you're still spreading this thing is maybe the most potent of all the signs for me. Again, it's also the most straightforward one. And I feel like the one that hopefully is on the front of your mind of like, what are we looking for? How do we experience this? It feels really, really important to me. Some of this, to kind of move from some of the political content just to more of my artistic practice, is that I'm constantly out in place. I want to be out in the world, experiencing it and figuring out what this is. And obviously, you know, you look at this photograph, and not only is it compositional, like, you know, from the bottom right, it comes down to the center, from the bottom right, it comes up. The sign itself kind of points towards the center. So there's some compositional techniques there I should point out. Those are the elements, the principles of art, the things that make visually interesting. But for me, being out there and experiencing Seneca Rocks, going up the hike and seeing what this whole thing was about, the drive down there and the drive away from that place was all incredibly important to me. To be able to find myself as a person, not just an artist, but as a human being in that space seems really, really important. So much of my practice is not just about a cultural context, but about place itself. So I want to throw a shameless plug in. I'm teaching a class that I'm very passionate about this spring called Places Practice. And if you're interested in figuring out what you're doing in West Virginia or Huntington, or what we are doing in this place, we're going to explore that.
Right. So thank you so much, Pat and Laura. And now we are at the part of our program where you get to ask questions. So if you have a question that you've been hanging on to, you can go ahead and type that into the Q&A chat box. And and in the meantime, I'm gonna, while you're thinking of your questions, I'm gonna go ahead. I have a couple of questions for the artists. And the first question that I have is really for either of you. One of the things I noticed both of you seemed to say about this body of work was that there were some surprises that happened in terms of what the end result of the work was, and even that maybe the work is still somewhat in progress, but differently than what you thought it was going to be when you first started out. And I'm wondering how common that is, or if that's just a coincidence that was both of your experience at this time, or like, how do you think about that when it happens that your work goes in a different direction than you originally intended?
Mm-hmm. Do you want me to start, Laura, or you want to jump on that?
I don't know. Things always change. Like, part of, I think I talked about that a little bit with the accepting that the process of making art is sometimes more important than the planned end result, and that it is important to have a guideline. It's very important to have a plan and to know where you're going and what you want. But the ideas that we have in our heads, and then what comes out on a sketchbook, and then what's created in the world, there are going to be tangible differences. And I think that that is pretty consistent in my practice. And it's consistent with students. And I think a lot of students actually get frustrated with that because they're like, I have this idea in my head and it's so perfect, and then I make it and I'm not satisfied. Well, good. You shouldn't be satisfied. Continue to make it again, continue to improve. I think Matt and I are both, you know, as new full-time professors here at Marshall, we're both dealing with a lot of new changes on top of making work for a show and learning to teach digitally and just all the stress of what we're going through. So was there a coincidence? Maybe a little, because the circumstances around this particular exhibit are unique. But I also think it's something that as an artist, you should always be responding to your work as you're making it, and that being adaptable is going to teach you to be happy with the end result rather than self-destruction about it.
Yeah, I think that's a good way of saying it. And some of this too is just that artists tend to work up completely to the end. And so hopefully that creation process never ends. It keeps molding and evolving. And that's part of the excitement for me, is that there's always this element of chance. involved, or most times in my work, there's an element of chance. So kind of the project that I didn't end up showing in the gallery was a series of signs that I'd put out for longer periods of time as these kind of public interventions to see if anybody would end up kind of destroying them or interacting with them, graffitiing with them. And, you know, 2 of the signs, none of that happened to, and 1 of the signs that I put up got stolen completely. And so there's some of that I think just more time and being able to play with that, it could be a really interesting kind of second part to that project. But for this one, you know, I was going all the way up to it and just seeing how a public interaction might happen. And when you take that chance with participation, I think for me, it's one of the most exciting, lively parts of the work. And sometimes it ends up not being anything at all. And I think that's okay too. And it's one of the things I like to point out to students, which is that so much of what you do, and I said it in the video, is like not ultimately seen. And I think that's a good thing. You're going to make better work if you keep mulling things over. Now, the hardest part of that, and I say this to my students all the time, is making work in this kind of classroom context is so difficult because you do have these very like strict structured deadlines, and sometimes it forces you to play and get in the mess of things, but it also like it might be too fast or like, you know, too intense to like, or structured to get into some of what is so exciting to me about artistic practice, which is letting ideas evolve as they may, and letting chance and participation in some of these other elements of art come in as they do.
Thank you, Matt. Now, I have another, and Laura, I have another question for you, Matt, from Anonymous. Do you ever record reactions of people viewing your signs?
I didn't do that in this series. I've done work like that before. I'm kind of interested, especially with this, but I've done a number of projects where whatever that reaction would be is more of a residue at the end of the day. So it's not me filming maybe someone's participation with my piece, but it's that piece may go missing, it may be marked on, it takes some other life on its own. But at least with this one, I didn't end up seeing how people reacted to it. But I've also done more, I would consider this a public kind of intervention where, of course, people might come along with it and I've become more hands-off. But I've also done projects where it's more performative based or more socially practiced based, where I'm interacting with people. And I love being able to have those conversations. But for this project in particular, it didn't feel quite like the right thing for what my kind of outcomes were.
Okay. And Laura, Anonymous, wants to know, did you intend for your figures to provide a sense of home/security? The cage structure heavily resembles primitive huts, tents, and they give off a very homely feeling. Great job.
That's an interesting, different perspective. No, that was not my intention. I was thinking very much about like Victorian binding, like hoop skirts and bird cages to connect with the bird theme of the cosmic egg and the nest. And I was also thinking about, you know, usually with those things, like the woman or the bird is inside this structure. So by placing it on top of it instead and having it as a support system rather than a retention system was important to me. But I love that you're seeing that as a sense of like security and home. And I think that the piece where I was thinking of it, making it in the same fashion that I was making the nest might allude back to that. But now that you've pointed it out, I can definitely see that. So thank you.
Okay, great. And then now I have another question, and I'm going to direct this to Matt. Actually, we have two related questions. So I'm gonna ask them both at the same time. One of them is, quote, not showing symptoms. I sometimes feel that white people who protest too much against racism are maybe overtly racist themselves. Do white people with their white privilege really understand? And the next question that is related is, how are just signs going to prevent racism? The inner hateful generational hashtag white racist thinking has to change, no?
Yeah, what was the first question exactly? You said not showing symptoms, and what followed there?
Yeah, so, and then it says, I sometimes feel that white people who protest too much against racism are maybe overtly racist themselves. Do white people with their white privilege really understand?
No. I don't think there's any way that I, as a white male, can quite understand racism to whatever degree communities of color understand that, for sure. I mean, in some ways, and to be clear also, I don't think a sign is going to directly change the way that someone might view themselves or how they would think about racism. I think a lot of this is like trying to create moments. The idea too would be that, like, could anyone come to this and maybe get to a place where they are trying to be a little bit more self-reflective? I don't know. I think there are very few art projects, to be honest, that get towards some kind of social issue within American culture and make a huge difference. There are some for sure that have tangible effects, but I think as artists we're trying to figure out how to switch or see people or see things in new ways. And I think that that's at the heart of what this is. There's something about it too that's just like a kind of a small, simple gesture towards something. Again, if there's a moment in someone's day, or again, they're going on a hike or they're going through these spaces, and there's something that takes them out of that space just for a second, stops them in their moment and asks them any question. And I know that's a really baseline effort, but I think we're in a place, especially with just kind of social media and technologies, that like it's not that often that we even just sit back on a daily basis to think about like who I am in this world, how am I working, how am I an ally, am I doing things to the best that I can, am I trying to change myself to create a better world? And I know those are just like really big questions, and I think it's kind of silly to think a sign might do that. And I'm not trying to promote that that's going to be the end result for anyone looking at these signs. But again, a small gesture that might stop one to be self-reflective, I think could happen with those. And I was interested in that.
Thank you, Matt. Okay. The next question is for Alora, and the question is, how many of the figures did Alora end up with? Is there a specific identity to the figures? You talked about influences of strong women, but you didn't necessarily identify any of the figures as a specific person. You're muted.
Thank you. Yeah, I have 3 in the gallery. There are still 10 more in process that are further along, and I am continuing to work on those. So I definitely will finish all 13. It's just a matter of juggling life, and I am really excited that I ended up with 3. I think that's a really significant number, and it worked out serendipitously that Matt also ended up with 3. So I think it works in the gallery space. As far as who these people are, the photos that I showed in the presentation are my specific inspirations. So the three that are currently in the gallery are a dear friend of mine named Emily, who was a strong inspiration through a healing and traumatic part of my life. And the main figure that I showed with the hair and the little video of her turning, her name is Josephine, and I was her nanny for many years. She is actually becoming a grandmother today. So her daughter that I nannied is literally giving birth today, and that's very exciting. And then the third figure that I completed is Melissa Macleod, who has been a very dear friend of mine and a strong colleague here at Marshall University. She's the sculpture technician in the art warehouse. And so those are the first three people that I completed. I could tell you about every single woman that I chose in every single one of those pictures. But ideally, you know, I want these people, these sculptures to reflect not only the women in my life, but also the strong archetypes of divine femininity throughout history and pop culture and the stories and myths that we tell ourselves. And I would hope that by not necessarily tacking their names onto them in the art space, that it creates a sense of, you know, this could be your friend. This could be someone that you might cross paths with someday. This could be somebody that makes you think of your mother or your sister or your aunt that's not actually related to you, but has been a significant figure in your life. And so I really wanted them to remain somewhat anonymous so that they could be relatable, but also have a sense of specificity, because, you know, there's that common thing in art where if you start to paint a crowd, everybody's face in the crowd looks the same. And so I really wanted them to have very unique, individual, distinct identities. So thank you for asking that. Oh, Jamie, now you're muted.
Oh, thank you. Laura, did you approach the women that you selected to be in the project before you started work on it?
Most of them, not all of them. Some of them I haven't been able to contact for various reasons. Some of them were very enthusiastic and excited and gave me specific photographs to work from. So some of them are no longer alive. And yeah, so there's a variety in there.
Okay, great. And I guess we'll do one more question for Matt. Matt, since you did this work first in Colorado, and that's where you're from, have you had the work anywhere else besides Colorado and West Virginia?
Not with this one yet, but I feel like this is something that will come along as it goes. So the first one, since it was right around June when it rolled out, and it was for a grant, it was actually presented in a virtual manner on a website. So it wasn't virtual in this sense, even with a live remote kind of effort. And so that lived on in a digital online sphere. And so this is the first time where I've printed the photos and got them into a physical space. And so after you have that kind of work become a physical manifestation, then you can start to apply to these other things or find other shows. And so I'm hoping that the body of work keeps being shown, and I think it'll keep growing. I'm interested in doing some more of these trail signs and seeing where the whole project evolves to. The project part 2 that I had talked about earlier is something that I'll come back to as well, and just seeing how the project grows overall. I'm still interested in kind of taking it to other places. One of the interesting parts about dealing with something like a national forest is it does weirdly translate across the nation. So it's something that any state that has a national forest, even back in my home state of Indiana, we have a small one. So I'm kind of curious, like, how might those signs be read or engaged with in different areas? And so that's kind of the next step with the project.
Okay, Well, thank you both so much.
Yeah, of course.
It's my pleasure. Thank you, Jamie.
All right. And thank you, everybody, for being here tonight and bearing with us through the technical challenges. Remember that we have another reception coming up on Monday, so that's just a few days away. And thank you so much. Have a great weekend.
Thanks, guys.
Bye.
Bye.